Week 8 Stranger Things, Necromancy, Zombies, and Demonic Possession. The relationship between the living and the dead has been an important aspect of human society since the beginning of recorded history. So basically, the concept that the dead were controllable has been important since that time as well, particularly as related to the method of divination, so called by the Greeks as necromancy. So with necromancy, basically the concept is that the dead could be summoned in order to learn information that basically only people who have passed on and have an awareness of what we might call the spirit world or the larger workings of fate and history that just simply would not be accessible to the average person. So various types of mediums or witches, we might say, or necromancers would utilize the dead in order to obtain such information. So it's not just in Greece we find the practice of necromancy occurring in the ancient world, but basically in all of the larger centers of antiquity. So we're talking Egypt as well as Mesopotamia / Babylonia. Now, a good source on this is Strabo, who was a Greek geographer, philosopher, and historian who basically refers to the necromantia, or as the diviners by the dead, in other words, as the foremost practitioners of divination amongst the people of Persia. So again, harking back into kind of the Mesopotamian Babylonian area, but specifically calling out the tribe of the Persians specifically. So for the Babylonians, these priests were known as the Man-Zazu, or the Sha-Itimu. And basically, we see here the spirits that they were able to raise, to command, were known as the Itimu. So Sha being the extension thereof to create the actual category for the sorcerer or necromancer themselves in terms of the etymological distinction. So if you were happily dead and you'd passed on to the other plane, so to speak, your fear of being summoned or brought back by a necromancer was reduced, because it was believed that it was specifically the restless dead, or those who had died under circumstances that were either considered before their time or there was some kind of unfinished business. These are the spirits that are the most susceptible to being brought back. So basically, for the necromancers, they were able to summon the soul and bind them to their will to basically exploit these poor spirits for information. So basically, in this sense, not every single spirit or dead entity was happily being brought back. So in other words, they were reluctant to actually divulge their information. So sometimes they had to be prodded so that they would actually spill the beans, so to speak. So for this sense, there were known necromantic spells that could compel them to converse and actually compel them to, I guess we say, reveal their divinatory potential. So one such spell or rite that's come down for necromancy through the Greeks was understanding of the ceremony of evocation, which is described in Homer's The Odyssey. And here the summoner is basic protocol to summon the dead is to dig a shallow pit, and then into the pit he or she is to pour the libation, which is simply a preparation of honey and sweetened milk, wine, water, and also too offerings of barley and blood. So once this is poured into the pit, then there is a burnt sacrifice and prayers to the gods of the dead, including Hades and Persephone, that are recited, and this is what will bring about the rising or the return of the deceased. So the actual account of the raising of the dead in the Odyssey is built around the hero Odysseus and his travel back home to Ithaca. And basically, he needs to find out exactly how to do so in order to do that, he consults with the witch Circe, who was a powerful sorcerer who he's being held captive for him and his men on an island for a long duration of time. But eventually, Odysseus is able to befriend the witch, and she offers him advice in terms of how to actually raise the dead. So Odysseus goes to the entrance of Hades, which is the underworld for the Greeks, incites the evocation, and then that he's been taught by Circe, and various ghosts come to, basically, we can think of the entrance to Hades as a cave or an opening to the underworld. And the ghosts start to appear towards the entrance. And one of these ghosts is a renowned prophet by the name of Tiresias of Thebes. So this is basically the entity that Odysseus wants to converse in order to find out the future and gain advice of what's the best way to get back home. So Odysseus learns from Tiresias that the reason he's not able to get home is because his crew and himself have offended the sea god Poseidon. Basically, in their earlier adventures, they had blinded the Cyclops Polyphemus, who was a son of Poseidon. So in revenge, Poseidon is barring their return home. So basically, Tiresias gives the advice with regards to how to get past kind of the, what we might call Poseidon's barred gates, which were known as Scylla and Charybdis, which in the classical world were what we might call two monsters of the ocean that sailors were often kind of met their doom in terms of going, not being able, I guess we could say, to part the middle, but being sucked into one of these two, which typically are conceptualized as like rocky crags or like jettisons of rock that kind of stick out in the water, and then kind of like these strange water currents that basically would suck sailors into their doom. So through Tiresias, basically Odysseus is given the knowledge how to get beyond that. And then also too, he's also warned by Tiresias that he should not eat the cattle of Helios when they arrive at the island of Thrinacia, which regrettably Odysseus' men don't follow, and they end up dying later in the story. But here, once again, proof that of the divinatory powers of the dead, particularly someone who was a prophet in life, such as Tiresias. So comparable to Greek tradition, obviously the Romans borrowed many of the Greek religious and philosophical concepts. And one of those that has come over or was shared was the concept of the necromancer and how they work. And one famous encounter with a necromancer is in the epic poem by Lucian, Pharsalia, which is basically an account of the civil war between Caesar and Pompey, which was in the years 49 BCE to 45 BC, so really towards the end of the Roman Republic. And the story goes that on the eve of the battle in Greece, Sextus, who was a son of Pompey, sought out the powerful witch named Erythko, basically to find out what the outcome of the battle next day was going to be. So upon being summoned, Erythko enacts probably something similar to the same rite that would have been performed by Odysseus at the advice of Circe, and she brings forth from the dead, or summons, a slain Roman soldier, so probably someone who had died in the fighting maybe in the day prior. And basically this reanimated corpse appears, and Erythko binds the soldier with spells and basically compels or impels the soldier to reveal what the battle the next day would bring. So even though the ghost is reluctant, he basically foretells two things. One is that the next day Pompey is going to lose, and the second, though, is that even though Caesar is going to win the battle the next day, he is eventually going to be assassinated. So these two events are actually historically accurate, and therefore adding to the prophetic power of the story and of the witch's power or hypothetical powers as well. So generally, the Hebrews, in contrast to the other cultures that surrounded them, there was generally a prohibition against the activities of necromancy. So in this case, there's not much mention in the scriptures of the divinatory practice. But with the exception, there is this, I guess we could say, allowance upon the part of God, or the authority of God, to communicate with the dead if the individuals who are doing so are favored. So those would be people such as martyrs or saints. And typically, though, these would not be considered the same thing as the magical practice of a necromancer, because through the magical act themselves, the necromancer is the power or the agency that is granting the authority, whereas with the martyrs and saints, it's a God who does so. So typically not mentioned in the Bible, but obviously it was something that was prominent enough in the ancient Near East that the ancient Israelites also had strict prohibitions against such practices. One such prohibition is basically in Leviticus 20:27, where the Mosaic law basically prescribes the death penalty for the practice of necromancy. And one of the examples where this is breached, particularly as it would have been played out in the Old Kingdom period, was in the example of King Saul, who basically requested from the Witch of Endor to evoke the spirit of the prophet Samuel, who was a judge and prophet who was currently residing in Sheol, which is the underworld of the ancient Hebrews. You can see in the root of the word there are etymological or word science understanding or study of what would eventually become the word hell, but obviously slightly different. This is more akin to the Greek concept of kind of the place of shadows, not necessarily one equated with punishment per se, but kind of like the shadow realm. It came to pass in those days that the Philistines gathered their forces in preparation for war against Israel. And Saul saw the forces and feared. Saul consulted the Lord, and he did not respond to him, neither through dreams, nor through priests, nor through prophets. And Saul said to his servants, "Find for me a woman with the power of divination, and I will go to her and consult her." And his servants told him that there was a woman with the power of divination at Endor. And they came to the woman by night, and he said to her, "Divine for me with a spirit, and raise up for me whomever I say." And the woman said to Saul, "I see gods rising up from the earth." And he said to her, "What does he look like?" She said, "An old man rises, and he is shrouded in a cloak." And Saul knew that it was Samuel, and he bowed with his face to the ground and paid him respect. Then Samuel said to Saul, "Why have you disturbed me to raise me up?" And Saul said, "I am in a very tight spot, for the Philistines wage war against me, and God has turned away from me, and does not answer me, neither through the power of the prophets, nor through dreams. Therefore I have summoned you, so that you may show me what to do." And Samuel said, "What is the use of asking me when the Lord has turned away from you and gone over to your rival? Tomorrow you and your sons will be with me, but the Lord will give the camps of Israel into the hands of the Philistines." So we see here in the tale of Saul and his necromantic effort through the Witch of Endor to raise Samuel, that the act or the prohibition or violating the prohibition of the declaration against necromancy does not end well for Saul. So even though Saul is considered to be one of the great kings of the Old Testament or Old Kingdom period, it basically is probably in part an aspect of his downfall. So Saul resorts to necromancy in what we might say a fallen condition where he is out of favor with Yahweh or the God of the Bible. So once again, we see this notion of raising the dead, particularly as it's related to the early, I guess we could say, precursors or ideas that were in the prophets, particularly Ezekiel chapter 37, 1-14, about the notion of the resurrection of the body. So basically there is some confusion with regards to what exactly the afterlife looks like for Judeo-Christian tradition. In some accounts, it's understood that the dead remain in some kind of limbo state until the end of time, when the Messiah will come and their bodies will be raised up. And part of that tradition, which was the original tradition, we might say, according to the persecuted Jews who in times of kind of tribulation in later periods looked upon these passages, such as this one specifically, and found the promise of everlasting life or an afterlife. So in this sense, how could a God of Israel who was just permit like their enemies to murder them in what would seem like an unjust existence? So in order to find some kind of extension of that, this account here, which is basically in Ezekiel, is a reference to bringing the people back from the Babylonian captivity and bringing them back to Israel. We see this metaphor of the notion of bringing people back to the land so that God's Spirit will be breathed into them and then they will live again. So in this sense, in the vision that Ezekiel has, he sees a valley of bones. And in this vision, he basically sees these bones lift up and become animated. So not only is this the early roots of the idea of resurrection and the afterlife for the Hebrews, but also, too, we can see here this connection with the concept of the dead and the dead being risen. So if we go back even further, back into the Mesopotamian origins of a similar scene, we see in the descent of Ishtar, the goddess Ishtar says, so basically she descends to the underworld, and she's at the gate, so to speak, and she threatens, if you do not open the gate for me to come in, I shall smash the door and shatter the bolt, basically throwing open the gates to the underworld. I shall smash the doorpost and overturn the doors. I shall raise up the dead, and they shall eat the living, and the dead shall outnumber the living. So here is this ancient reference of basically the dead once again walking the earth, and not only that, but also to eating the living. So in terms of contemporary equivalents to this, one would automatically drift in towards the notion of the zombie. So for nearly a century, zombies have served as an archetype of this fear that is associated with the resurrection or the end of time or the apocalypse. And what is interesting about the term zombie is that basically it derives from Haitian voodoo. And even though this is present in the original White Zombie film of 1932 to a large extent, in later zombie films, this concept of the zombie is lost. And basically, to see the difference, we'll discuss a little bit more about what the actual folklore Haitian version of a zombie is, in contrast to the average Walking Dead entity that it's looking to eat human brains of pop culture of more recent times. So for Haitian folklore, the actual zombie is a dead person who's been physically revived by an act of necromancy, specifically. A particular voodoo sorcerer or witch by the name of a Bokur. And in this sense, the actual zombie or a dead person who has been risen by the necromancer Bokur is actually a personal slave of the witch or sorcerer. So in this sense, there is a fear in Haitian of the theft of corpses from graveyards, because if a Bokur can acquire your corpse, then through the various rites, they're able to reanimate you in the sense of being more or less a working serf or a slave who was made to work in the sugar mills and fields at night, or potentially some are also used to guard the Bokur's personal residence. So more recent times, in terms of what we might say scientific rationalization of the folklore of zombies, going back even to 1938 in Zora Hurston's account, she basically suggests that there could be a material basis to the zombie phenomena. Specifically, that maybe the zombies aren't actually the awakened dead, but are people who only appear dead. And this has been induced basically by some kind of drug, which is known by the Bokurs. And obviously, in this sense, it works to destroy the brains of those people who have been attacked or victims of the Bokur. And in this sense, obviously, it destroys a part of the brain which governs willpower and a person's ability to speak. So they're still alive in a sense, but they're alive in the sense of being more or less a working zombie or a working slave. So in this sense, a zombie represents the ideal of the individual who's enslaved to others, okay, or he's been placed in the service of the Bokur. And in this lifestyle, the zombie basically subsists upon meals that are served on banana leaves, like the former slaves of Saint Dominic. Okay, so in this sense, we see here kind of these, I guess we would say, combining elements of the past tradition of slavery along with the occult and supernatural into a narrative of fear that's based around slavery and the understanding that, in a sense, it is dehumanizing. So in this dehumanizing aspect, we almost get this understanding that to be alive in such a daily existence is to be, in a sense, undead. So former high priest of Voodoo in Haiti was Max Beauvoir, who passed away in 2015. And he basically, as the high priest of Voodoo, so probably specializing in necromancy himself as a Bokur, he suggests that people who are zombified it's done as a matter of punishing asocial or antisocial behavior towards individuals. So it's not just simply the Bokur that passes the judgment either, but this is done in some kind of communally, what we might say, ruled or governed group of elders who would pass judgment upon such instances to see that whether or not someone's actions have been deemed so antisocial that turning them into a zombie is warranted or not. So the one famous example from recent history is the story of Clairvius Narcissi, who basically, he was a Haitian whose father had passed away, and he was the inheritor or prime inheritor of a plot of land that basically he wanted to sell so he could leave and go to the United States. Typically, most Haitians who do so end up in Miami, so he was following suit in this tradition. But at the time, basically, the people in the community tried to discourage him, because if he did sell the plot and take the money and leave, he was basically abandoning the rest of his family and leaving them with nothing. So ultimately, he persists, and this basically brings down the consternation of the, what we might call the group of elders of the Vodun priests caste, who decide that ultimately he should be turned into a zombie for his attempts to, what we might say, leave his family high and dry. So it's reported that he passes away, and shortly thereafter his corpse, or we might say he's seen subsequently in the area once again after his own death and burial. Whether or not this account is true, or whether or not it was actually Narcissi himself or someone who merely resembled him, people speculate, but ultimately there are several different accounts of a similar nature where someone was thought dead, and there's sightings of the person, and the person is non-responsive to individuals who encounter them, typically in the various accounts that have come down to us. So medieval Judaism has something akin to a zombie in the manifestation of the monster, the golem. So with golem, comparable to a zombie, it has no inherent ability to think for itself, but it's ultimately animated by the power of what we might call the magician or the Kabbalist, or even as it presents itself in the various stories as the rabbi, particularly. So typically the golem is animated by a magical word which is written on its forehead, and also too could be some kind of a scroll that's placed inside the mouth, which brings the creature to life. Now, the most famous of the golem stories is that of the Golem of Prague. So the story of the Golem of Prague is about the Rabbi Judailo ben Zalel, which he was a late 16th century rabbi in Prague who created a golem out of clay and brought it to life, reportedly using the rituals of various Kabbalistic Hebrew incantations. And the reason he did this was because of anti-Semitic attacks that had been occurring against the ghetto. So there are various versions of the story of the Golem of Prague, but one of the versions has it that the golem goes on a murderous rampage, and in response, the rabbi has to try and stop this creature that is basically now beyond his control. So in order to do that, he removes the scroll from within the mouth, known as a shem, to immobilize the golem. So therefore, the life energy is removed through removing the word which was on the scroll within the golem's mouth. In other versions, it's simply a wiping off of the forehead of the magical word. So obviously different components, right? And once the magical word is removed, the golem basically falls to pieces. And in this case, in this account, it was directly in front of the synagogue of Prague. So in this sense, we see here this dynamic similar to the necromancer and the zombie, or the necromancer and the living dead, between the rabbi and the golem. So the golem is, in the beginning, the faithful servant of the rabbi, but any what we might say unnatural development, particularly in Judeo-Christian tradition, or something that is an abomination, such as a golem, eventually something goes awry, and control is lost by the rabbi, therefore necessitating the actual ending or the terminating of the golem's existence. So in comparison, when we talk about demonic possession, what we're talking about is basically, obviously, from most people's understanding, demonic possession is a presence that is taking up residence in someone's body. So that's specifically that of a demon. right? So in this sense, the possession is referring to being controlled either directly or indirectly by a supernatural force. So whereas the necromancer controls externally, the actual dead, in this case, like the demon, is actually brought into the living and is operative within. But we see a similar notion of being overtaken and becoming less than human, and almost being overwhelmed by some kind of mystical or magical essence. So the standard symptoms, we might say, of demonic possession have not changed much really since what we might say ancient times, leading back to Babylon. And typical traits, we might say, of demonic possession have remained fairly consistent, as individuals being identified as suffering from such a fate, or people who are missing like memories, have all of a sudden have like multiple personalities, almost like multiple personality disorder in a non-clinical sense of the term, like epileptic seizures or fits, people convulsing, fainting, any kind of spastic hand movements are all physical and psychosomatic indicators that basically someone could be possessed. Now, according to modern day exorcists, the 1976 film The Exorcist itself is generally fairly accurate. Obviously, there's some sensationalization in terms of the special effects, etc., but a lot of the actual undertakings that happened to the little girl are reported in various modern accounts as actually taking place in historical individuals. So also interesting, according to modern exorcists too, is this understanding that demonic possession is also on the uptick or uprise. So here's a short animated video discussing the rise of modern, what we might call the renewal of the necessity of contemporary exorcists and various cases of modern exorcisms. So just pause this, pop the link into, or follow the link into YouTube, whatever works best for you, and then you'll be able to watch and see some of these actual accounts that have occurred, or probably the three most famous cases of the last 50 to 70 years. So as I said in brief passing before, a lot of the rites of the Christian church have survived from basically older traditions such as the Sumerians and the Babylonians. And intrinsic to this was this linking with the demonic and disease. So this could be mental illness or it could be physical illness. But obviously pre-scientific, pre-health sciences days, a lot of ailments of mind and body to try and explain, according to a religious or magical thinking worldview, what exactly was happening. It's not a stretch that people would associate all of a sudden being overtaken by some kind of external power that it has almost possessed or attacked yourself as either mentally or physically or both. So in this sense, the Sumerians had this concept of sickness demons, which they called the Giddim. And they had special priests or exorcists that were linked to actually exorcising such demons. And they were known by the names of the Ashipu. Woo. So in connection, there's this notion that you were able to appeal because in these times it wasn't the what we might call demonology of the Sumerians was not built upon a dualistic worldview of good and evil the same way that Judeo-Christian, later Judeo-Christian traditions would be. So for them, the similar deities or demons could be used for good or evil. So there were various tablets that contained prayers that would ask certain gods for help in protection against demons, and others that would ask gods to expel such demons, particularly those that through sickness had invaded people's bodies. So with the Babylonian demons, as we were saying, the link between evil and protecting demons is quite often unclear. So in one sense, you might enlist the help of one demon to fight against another demon. And the most famous example of this is the demon from the Exorcist film. If you follow the link here in the description, you'll see the opening scene where the archaeologist in the desert finds Pazuzu. And Pazuzu here, just depicted here in the image on the right, is basically a demon who is utilized by the ancient Babylonians to ward off another demon by the name of Lameshtu. And although Pazuzu considered himself to be an evil spirit, he also frightens away other evil spirits. So in this sense, he's used by humans to protect against plagues and other misfortunes. So quite often, Pazuzu, who for the Sumerians was the king of the demons of the wind, so brother of Humbaba, who was the son of Hanabi, and basically he represented the southwestern wind as the bearer of storms and drought. And so he was basically renowned as bringing famine during the dry season or locust during the rainy season. So obviously not a good entity in and of himself, but at the same time he was also utilized specifically to combat his rival, the malicious goddess Lameshtu. And she was believed to cause harm to the mother and child during childbirth, which is akin to the later tradition of the old hag that we spoke about in Dream Week, and also has associations with the Lilith mythology or mythos from later Hebrew tradition. So particular demons besides Shamashu and Pazuzu, there was also the Maskim, who were the 7 demons of the Syrian religion that were closely associated. And we see here kind of a parallel in or I might say a precursor to the narrative of the revolt in heaven of Judeo-Christian tradition. Now, Marduk is what we might call the Yahweh or God figure or Zeus figure of kind of the Assyrian Babylonian tradition, who ultimately puts the powers of chaos and kind of the older gods or titans and subdues them so that order and the rule of the current age of man is able to take place. So in this sense, though, these older entities still exist, and for them, they're associated with the evil spirits of the 7 planets. So in comparison, we see in Hebrew mythos this concept of the Watchers. Okay, so in essence, they're associated with kind of the inversion of what we might say the astrological influences of the planets, but this is why they're associated with the underworld, or those planets that are underneath the horizon. So it's almost like the reflection or the negative side of the planets. So these would be the ones that would be considered under the horizon or this earth or sea. And that. So the description of the Maskim that have come down to us, basically they're known as the south wind, the dragon with a huge mouth, a grim leopard that carries off the young, a fearless wolf, a wild ass, a rampant that marches against king and god, and a storm as an evil wind which brings flood and destruction. So in this sense, there isn't a terrible amount of details to go on, but we can see basically the equivalent in these 7 to the later understanding or Judeo-Christian understanding of the 7 deadly sins. So the 7 deadly sins probably the most paramount of demonic, I guess we could say, associations in Judeo-Christian, particularly medieval period. So 7 sins again were envy, gluttony, greed, lust, pride, sloth, and wrath. And each of these sins is ruled over basically by a different demonic entity. So for envy, for example, it's Leviathan, who is the great sea creature from the Bible, and basically associated with chaos, the sea, and then too the negative traits that are associated with envy would be arrogance, okay, and this understanding of I guess we could say feeling some kind of resentment towards others for things that are good for them. So in this sense, we see, right, these powers are internal to ourselves, but there is equally a demon and ultimately a particular sin that are associated. So for gluttony, it's Beelzebub, who's the prince of demons or the lord of the flies, right? And greed and mammon. You can't serve God and wealth at the same time, or you can't serve God and mammon, is the old saying. So for lust, which is obviously a big one, it's Asmodeus, who was what we might call the monster who would inspire people to deceit, revenge, gambling, and primarily any kind of like physical sexual kind of fixations that plague people and can often ruin people's lives. So for pride, obviously Lucifer as the great angel who fell due to pride and then became the leader of the fallen angels, so to speak. Sloth, which is basically indifference or extreme laziness or spiritual apathy, is under the control of Belphegor. And then wrath, again, goes back to Lucifer, or in this terminology to Satan, as basically this concept of great adversary. The great adversary being the great adversary, he inspires mankind to turn away from the divine or God. So in this sense, wrath could almost be like this notion of like violence or unnatural, like attacking of God's order, so to speak. So going back to Mesopotamian exorcist rites, we see this concept of the scapegoat, okay, which is known as what we might call a transferal or a substitute of either a lamb, a pig, or a bird, or even in particular cases the creation of a clay figure, which is basically offered up in a sacrificial rite in exchange for the life of a victim. So in the Bible, we see a parallel in the Synoptic Gospels of Jesus exorcising demons from a man in the country of Gerasenes who had become possessed and was living in the nearby graveyard. And basically, as almost like a wild man, had evaded the attempts to capture it and chain him. So in the story, basically when Jesus confronts the man falls at his feet and begs him not to harm him. And then Jesus asks him what his name is, and he replies, "My name is Legion, for we are many." So in this sense, Legion is obviously indicating that, you know, there's more people at home than just the mortal individual whose body is in the presence of Jesus. So in this sense, okay, the demon from there goes on to beg Jesus not just to simply cast him out into the countryside. So upon seeing a group of nearby pigs, the demon asks to be cast into them instead. So once this is granted through the exorcism enacted by Jesus, then the pigs quickly rush off and right to what we might say the sea's edge and jump off the cliff into the sea and drown themselves very dramatically. So in comparison to the swine into the sea, we see in the film The Exorcist that once again we have this notion that in order to cure the possessed, there has to be some kind of exchange. And the exchange here from the 1976 movie, if you follow the link, it will show you the video of the scene. But basically, the father, the main hero exorcist or priest, is Father Merrin, and in the end, he exchanges himself for the life of the girl. So when we get down to this notion, or kind of the root or underlying notion of possession, we get into the earlier etymology of the words for inspire. And in this sense, in the inspiration close to the concept of breathing or respiration. So we see similar root words there, or roots within the word. And in this sense, inspiration is known as breath, or to blow into, as in originally used in the sense of the divine or supernatural. And in this sense, to it being not just breath, but also in the sense as imparting an idea or a truth to someone. So this obviously has associations with the creation account in Genesis, and God breathing life into man or humanity, and then also too with the breath of life, ruach, over the seas, right? So this understanding of inspiration and enthusiasm, but it even goes further than this. So beyond the concept of just being the breath of life, we get into this notion of enthusiasm as meaning to be possessed by a God's essence. So beyond demonic possession, the source of the word goes back really into that of simply a God in the lowercase sense of the term. So this could be, on average, this could be a positive influence or a negative influence. So if it was you're under the divine possession or influence or enthusiasm of the god Apollo, that would mean you were probably using your rational mind quite effectively. Or if it was via Dionysus, then more than likely you would be under the influence of probably some wine or debauchery or some kind of partying. Okay, so in this sense, it's almost as though these influences were descriptors of archetypal energies that are common to human activities. So when it comes to looking at the understanding of the devil and demons as fallen angels, we're not too far from this earlier understanding that the gods, through enthusiasm, were in some way influencing humanity through some kind of possession that was spiritual in nature, but also affecting the material or the bodily. So for the actual notion of Satan and his angels as being demonic, well, the original source of that is to recognize that in their, I guess we could say, root history, it was understood that beyond the later understanding of a moral dualism where the lines were neatly drawn, this understanding of whatever is occurring in possession is largely angelic, whether good or bad. So this relates back to the earlier understandings from earlier cultures that were not necessarily monotheistic and morally dualistic in the same way that later Judeo-Christian tradition became. So more specifically, in ancient Greece, there was belief in what we might call a guardian angel or a guardian spirit known as a daemon. And this was basically the spirit that would accompany people in life, your personal Jiminy Cricket, so to speak, okay, or Tinkerbell. So more common or more recent, Philip Pullman, in his book series, his Dark Material, says this, understand, we see here from the earlier film starring Daniel Craig and Nicole Kidman, we see here that people are equipped with a daemon which takes an animal form. So in this sense, the earlier understanding of a daemon, which is obviously the root of the word demon, we have something far more morally ambivalent, or morally not necessarily clear-cut as being evil in the demonic sense of later Judeo-Christian understanding. So going back to the Greek poet Hesiod, who basically he suggested that a daemon were figures that were to be honored after death, that were basically people of the golden age who had been transformed as something that was not the divine or the material, but in some kind of intermediate, or had become some kind of intermediate entity. And in this sense, they acted by the will of Zeus to serve as guardian spirits to the living. So even though they remained invisible, people would know them by their acts, and basically they were believed to instow upon people protection and good fortune. So this concept of the daemon goes back even to the classic philosophers, specifically Plato and Socrates. So for Plato and Socrates, the definition of the daemon it translates literally as a divine something, was like an inner voice for Socrates that he said that would frequently warn him against mistakes, but never told him exactly what to do. So if we think what exactly we're getting at here, guardian angel, or some concept of like consciousness, right? So in the Pinocchio story, Jiminy Cricket is often associated with being, well, he in the Disney film, he identifies himself as Pinocchio's conscience, right? So in this sense, it's this directing voice that is not really telling you what to do, but kind of gives you a sense of what you should be doing. So for the Greeks, it's this notion that a daemon, traditionally before it becomes demon, is really your guarding spirit, or something to be opened up to and to listen to, in terms of finding out what the will of the divine, or the will of God, actually is. So akin to his Dark Materials, Pullman's notion that the daemon is embodied in some kind of an animal entity links back to the medieval practice of familiars, that were basically most common familiar known is the cat, the black cat of the witch. But obviously other things such as a hare, a black dog, a toad, all of these animals are potential candidates to being actual familiars of witches. And what they basically are, according to what we might say the ideological propaganda of the repressive elements of kind of what responsible for the witch burnings, etc., these would be considered as demons in the derogatory sense of the term. So in this way, during the Great Panic, one of the things that people were on the outlook for when identifying a witch was whether or not there were any types of animals or associations with animals. So if you were an elderly woman living in a village and you had a pet cat, well, that could be an indicator that you were actually a witch. So real intrinsic, or I guess we could say instrumental, and really bringing about the persecutions that came from the witch burnings, etc., in Europe, was James I of England in 1604. And basically he brought in a new Witchcraft Act that made working with evil spirits a capital offense. So by capital offense, we just simply mean that if you were caught working with evil spirits, you would basically be executed. So also in this act was the reference to familiars. So specifically it says that they're believed to be the witch's helpful demonic companions. So basically, in this sense, in the medieval period, familiars weren't necessarily physical animals, but rather they're spirits that took the form of these animals. So furthermore, we can see in the sense that the witch is in control of a spirit, okay, it's really quite reminiscent of the practice of necromancy itself. So whereas we have the zombie for the boker, well, in medieval Europe we have the black cat for the witch, etc. So by the time we get to the witch hunts of the 17th century, familiars were known more popularly as imps, and it was believed that they would feed on the blood of the witch and act as their servants. But basically, this is where we get this notion of a witch's mark, which basically we look at the bottom image here in the bottom right of the jurors examining the bare back of the young woman here, and the one older woman pointing at obviously a marking on her back. And what she's basically pointing out is what we might call the witch's mark, or what was called as a teat, in the sense of another feeding device, in terms that wasn't necessarily the nipples of the breast, was located somewhere else on the body where the witch would suckle her familiars, okay, or imps. So in this sense, familiars would teach witches how to do magic, and also provided them with advice, similar to the notion of the daemon from the Greeks, with obviously the exception probably of the magic, but certainly with the advice being consistent. Now, witches were also reported to use them as spies, and that the familiars or imps were also capable of shifting forms into various types of creatures. As we said, cats and dogs, owls, toads, mice, all of these animals, if reportedly seen in the proximity of the witch, would fall under suspicion. Or even if just simply seen, then it could be utilized to suggest that maybe the witch was in some way spying upon an individual. So unlike earlier stories with like the boker and the zombie, or the rabbi and the golem, the familiar didn't just do what it was told, but it could also make requests of the witch. So basically it would do this, and in exchange it would offer magical help to the witch. So ultimately, though, the witch themselves is not what we might call the puppet master extraordinaire, but we would say that the power behind witches, according at least to the witch trial propagandists, would be known as Satan. And in this sense, Satan is the source, or considered to be the source of their magic, or the source behind their powers. So ultimately, in this sense, witches were known as the brides of Satan. And for this, it was basically any kind of magic that was occurring, particularly of the dark variety, which people would basically set out to harm other people. It would be considered demonic in its root. So when we think of demons, in this sense, they're obviously, through this particular world lens, are thought of as being under the direct control of the devil. So he ultimately is the puppet master extraordinaire, which ultimately we see here in the medieval devil conception, this association with the earlier understandings of the necromancer's magical abilities. Okay, so in this sense, even though this becomes the concept of the devil, in earlier conceptions, hasn't always been the same. So when we're thinking of the devil as the ultimate puppet master, well, in terms of popular culture, the last 40 years or so, Iron Maiden, the British heavy metal rock band, the Number of the Beast released an album. I think this is 1983 or 82. This album came out. If you look at the cover art, Eddie is the kind of the zombie type figure in the blue jeans at the top, is acting as the puppet master of. If you look very closely at a better image of this, you'd see there's little strings that are being held in the hands of both Eddie and then of Satan as well. So below the Satan, under Satan's hand, is like a little human being there. So Eddie aside, what we see here is the depiction understanding that Satan is the great puppet master, or the kind of the force behind people that causes them to do bad things. So this is where we kind of get this notion of the sense of the concept, or saying the devil made me do it. Okay, so more or less similar in the sense, going back to the necromancer and the working of the dead and making them comply to his will, while the individual as sinner is merely complying to the will of the devil in the same sense. So this hasn't always been the case with what we would call Satan, who originally appears as an angel in the book of Job. So we can think of this as the book of Job appearance. He hasn't become the fallen angel in the sense that he is what we might almost call a dualistic worldview, in the sense of good versus evil, but more in the book of Job theology of the time, the understanding was God was in control. And Satan, in this sense, is almost working as an adversarial voice within, I guess we might say, the mind of God, if that was possible, which probably not exactly, but you get this sense where Satan is basically, God would say, oh, look at my servant Job, he's such a good man and living upright and in my ways. And then it would come around to Satan, he'd be like, well, yeah, but he's only being good because, things are looking pretty good for him. He's got a nice property, he's got lots of healthy and strong, good-looking children. Like, why wouldn't he follow your will? What would happen if all of a sudden his whole family died? Are you sure that he would still be, such an obedient servant to you? So we see here this role of the adversary, right? So in this sense, it's much closer to the Greek conception of a daemon versus a demon, in the sense that it is almost like this directing or voice. Specifically, in the more negative connotation, it's an aspect of the adversarial inner voice. So in truth, that part is there. Now, in the Garden of Eden, we go back even further, we see the serpent convinces Eve to eat the fruit. But once again, it's kind of this similar, it's this voice that is kind of like this inner voice that is basically prompting you to do something that there's some kind of prohibition against, but it's almost like temptation itself as a metaphorical embodiment, right? So here we see like this sense of the classical sense of daemon as kind of like an inner voice that is either one, driving us into temptation to our ruin, or two, in the terms of Socrates, leading us to moral uprightness. So in sum, we've seen that zombies, demons, golems, and familiars basically all link back to the ancient practice of necromancy. So more or less what we're identifying here is this common tendency for a lot of the concept of these entities have evolved over time, right? So whereas the demonic to the Greeks was different from that of the Babylonians, even more so to the later Judeo-Christian medieval period, such as that associated with the modern conception of the demonic, which really came out of James I's witch trials and kind of crusades, which were ideologically charged accounts, which ultimately are really operating on a misrecognition of what we might call the earlier Greek tradition of the daemons and guardian spirits. So ultimately, what we look at is we see the origin of a lot of these practices go back to ancient times, ancient practices and beliefs from Mesopotamia and Babylon, right? But as we're going to see when we start looking at aspects of these entities again in the upcoming weeks, particularly when we discuss channeling and invoking entities, okay, is that our understanding of exactly what we're referring to gets a little vague the farther we go back, because a ghost and a demon, okay, what exactly we're referring to in different parts of history are always necessarily clear cut, okay, and this really continues up into pretty well early modern times with regards to whether or not a sighting might be classified as demonic or if it was actually a ghost. But we'll talk more about that next week.